The alarm clock didn't need to ring at 4 in the morning because Owen Ashford had been waking at that hour for 18 years. His body tuned to the rhythm of timber and mountain roads, the way some men are tuned to the tides. He lay in the darkness for a moment, listening to the old farmhouse settle around him. The familiar creaks of wood that had stood for 80 years before he bought the place. Then he swung his legs over the side of the bed and his feet found the cold floor, and that small shock of discomfort was enough to get him moving. The coffee maker was older than some of the drivers at the mill, a Mr. Coffee machine with a cracked carafe that Sarah had always threatened to replace. That was before she left 7 years back, taking the curtains and the throw pillows and whatever part of him had known how to talk to another person about anything that mattered. Owen didn't miss the curtains. He missed the sound of someone else breathing in the house. But that was a thought he'd learned to pack away into the same mental box where he kept everything else that couldn't be fixed. Ketchum rose from his bed by the wood stove and stretched, his old bones popping audibly in the silence. The hound was 12 now, gray around the muzzle, but he still followed Owen through the morning routine with the dedication of a dog who'd never known another master. Owen scratched behind his ears and felt the tail thump against his leg, and that was about as much warmth as he needed before facing the day. The kitchen window looked out over the back 40, and in the pre-dawn darkness, Owen could just make out the shapes of the trees at the property line. Douglas firs and western red cedars, old growth that the logging companies hadn't touched because his grandfather had bought this land specifically to protect it. The irony wasn't lost on Owen. He made his living hauling timber while sitting on 40 acres of trees he'd never cut. But there was no contradiction in his mind. Some things were worth protecting, and some things were just business. He poured the coffee into a thermos and made himself 2 pieces of toast with butter, standing at the counter to eat them because sitting alone at the kitchen table felt too much like admitting something. Through the window, he watched the first gray light touch the tops of the cedars, and he thought about the load he'd be hauling today. Old growth from the Tillamook State Forest, destined for a mill in Longview. 12 hours on the road, most of it on mountain switchbacks that would make a lesser driver white-knuckle the wheel. Owen wasn't a lesser driver. He'd been running these roads since he was 22, fresh out of the service with a CDL and a need for solitude that civilian life couldn't seem to provide. The Cascade Range had given him what he needed: silence, purpose, and enough danger to keep his mind focused on something other than the emptiness waiting for him at home. The chicken coop sat 50 yards from the back porch, a structure he'd built himself the summer after Sarah left. 32 Rhode Island Reds, good layers every one of them, and the routine of feeding and watering and collecting eggs had become a kind of meditation for him. He pulled on his boots and his Carhartt jacket and stepped out into the October morning, his breath fogging in the cold air. The hens were already awake, making their soft morning sounds as he approached. He unlatched the coop door and stepped inside. The smell of hay and chicken feed and the particular warmth of 32 birds filling his nostrils. He counted them automatically, a habit born of coyote country, and found all present, their feathers fluffed against the morning chill. "Morning, ladies," he said, because he talked to the chickens more than he talked to most people. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, rusty from disuse. "Let's see what you got for me." The nesting boxes yielded 28 eggs, which was about right for this time of year. He collected them in the wire basket he'd hung by the door and scattered feed across the floor, watching the hens peck and scratch with their simple, focused hunger. There was something peaceful about chickens, Owen thought. They didn't ask questions. They didn't look at you with that particular expression that said they were worried about your mental state. They just lived their chicken lives and expected nothing more than food and water and a safe place to sleep. He finished the morning chores and drove the 40 minutes to the mill in Vernonia, his truck rattling over roads he knew by memory. The town wasn't much. A few thousand people who'd built their lives around timber. A main street with a diner and a hardware store and not much else. But it was home in a way that mattered to Owen. He knew these people. They knew him. And if they didn't know him well, that was by design. Hector was already at the loading dock when Owen pulled in, clipboard in hand, his breath making clouds in the cold air. Hector had been the yard foreman for going on 15 years. A compact man with a gray beard and eyes that missed nothing. Owen! A nod. Hector. Another nod. This was the extent of most of their conversations, and both men seemed to prefer it that way. Owen backed his rig up to the loading dock with the precision of long practice. And the day began in earnest. The drive up to the Tillamook took 3 hours, and the drive back down with a full load took 4. Owen ate his lunch behind the wheel, a sandwich he'd made the night before, turkey and cheese on white bread, and listened to the silence of the cab. He'd had a radio once, but it had broken years ago and he'd never bothered to fix it. The sound of the engine was company enough. The mountain roads were treacherous in the way that familiar things can still kill you if you stop paying attention. Switchbacks with 1,000-foot drops, gravel shoulders that crumbled without warning, logging trucks coming the other way that left inches of clearance on curves that God himself had designed to test the faithful. Owen had seen 3 men die on these roads, 2 of them good drivers who just had bad luck, and he respected the mountains the way you respect anything that can end you without meaning to. He delivered the load to Longview and made it back to Vernonia by 6, his shoulders aching and his eyes gritty with the particular fatigue of too many hours staring at asphalt. The other drivers were gone by then, but the night watchman waved as Owen pulled out of the lot, and that small gesture of recognition was enough human contact to carry him through until morning. The sun was setting as he turned onto his property, painting the western sky in shades of orange and red that he'd stopped noticing years ago. Beautiful things became invisible when you saw them every day. Another lesson the mountains had taught him. He parked the truck and sat for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. And then he walked up to the house to begin the evening routine. Feed the chickens, water the chickens, check the coop for signs of predators, let Ketchum out to do his business, crack 2 beers and sit on the porch until the darkness drove him inside. This was his life, and if it was small and quiet and emptier than it should have been, at least it was his. That particular October evening, something was different. Owen noticed it first with the chickens. When he opened the coop door, they didn't rush to greet him the way they usually did. Instead, they were huddled in the far corner of the coop, all 32 of them pressed together in a mass of feathers and nervous clucking. Their eyes were fixed on the back wall of the coop, the wall that faced the tree line, and they didn't look at him even when he scattered feed across the floor. "What's got into you?" he asked. But the hens didn't move. They just kept staring at that wall, their heads turning in small, jerky movements like they were tracking something he couldn't see. Owen felt the first stirring of unease, a cold fingertip tracing down his spine. He told himself it was nothing. Chickens were stupid animals, prone to panic over shadows and sounds that meant nothing. But he'd been raising these birds for 7 years, and he'd never seen them act like this. Not during thunderstorms. Not when the coyotes howled. Not even when that black bear had wandered through the property 2 summers back. He stepped outside and looked toward the tree line, but the cedars stood silent and still in the fading light. No movement, no sound, just the trees and the darkness gathering between them. That was when he noticed the silence. The woods behind his property were never quiet at dusk. Owls called to each other as they woke for the night's hunting. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their voices carrying across the hills. Frogs sang from the creek that ran along the eastern boundary. But tonight there was nothing. No owls, no coyotes, no frogs. Just a silence so complete that Owen could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He stood there for a long moment listening, waiting for the sounds to return. They didn't. The silence pressed against him like a physical weight, and he felt the hair on his arms rise even though he couldn't have explained why. "Getting jumpy in your old age," he muttered. But his voice sounded thin and wrong in that terrible quiet. He finished the evening chores quickly, not looking at the tree line, and went inside to find Ketchum standing at the back door. The hound was whining, a high-pitched sound Owen had never heard him make. His tail was tucked between his legs, and when Owen opened the door to let him out for his evening business, Ketchum backed away from the opening like it was a live snake. "Come on, boy, out you go." Ketchum whined again and pressed himself against Owen's legs, shaking. Owen looked out at the backyard, at the coupe and the tree line beyond it. The darkness was nearly complete now, the last light fading from the sky. He couldn't see anything out there, couldn't hear anything. But Ketchum's fear was contagious in a way that made Owen's hands want to reach for the shotgun he kept by the door. He closed the door and let Ketchum stay inside. And if anyone had asked, he would have said the dog was just having an off night. Dogs got scared sometimes. It didn't mean anything. But Owen didn't drink his beers on the porch that evening. He drank them at the kitchen table with his back to the wall and his eyes on the window, watching the darkness beyond the glass and waiting for something he couldn't name. The chickens didn't lay the next morning. Not a single egg from 32 hens that had never missed a day in 7 years. Owen stood in the coop, staring at the empty nesting boxes, and felt that cold finger trace down his spine again. "Probably stress," he said to no one. "They'll get over it." But the chickens didn't get over it. Not the next day or the day after that. They stayed huddled in their corner, facing the tree line, and the woods stayed silent, and Ketchum refused to go outside after dark. Owen drove to the feed store in Vernonia and bought a game camera, the kind hunters use to track deer movement. He set it up at the tree line, pointing into the woods, and told himself he was just checking for cougars. Mountain lions had been moving into the area over the past few years, pushed down from the high country by wildfires and development. A big cat would explain the chickens' behavior. It would explain Ketchum's fear. It would explain everything. The first night, the camera's memory card was blank. Not empty. Blank. When Owen plugged it into his computer, the card showed the right number of files, but every image was pure static, gray and white noise like an untuned television. Defective card, he told himself, and he bought a new one. The second night, the same thing. Static. Gray noise. Nothing. The third night, Owen sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and watched the camera's infrared light blink in the darkness. At 2:17 a.m., he remembered the time exactly, though he couldn't have said why, the light stopped blinking. Just stopped, like someone had turned it off. Owen went inside and locked the door and didn't sleep until dawn. He mentioned the silent woods to Hector at the mill the next day, keeping his voice casual, like it was just something he'd noticed in passing. Hector laughed and slapped him on the shoulder. "You've been alone too long, Owen. Start hearing things when it's too quiet, or not hearing things." Hector shook his head. "You should come to the bar with us sometime. Get out of that house." Owen nodded and said maybe he would, knowing he wouldn't. He drove his route and hauled his timber and tried not to think about the camera that had stopped working at 2:17 a.m. Sheriff's Deputy Martinez came by on his monthly rural check, a young man who took his job seriously and seemed genuinely concerned about the older folks who lived alone on the outskirts of town. Owen told him about the chickens and the silence and the game camera, and Martinez nodded and wrote something in his notebook. "Probably coyotes," the deputy said. "They've been more aggressive this year. State wildlife guy thinks it's the drought pushing them into new territory." He handed Owen a pamphlet about livestock protection, the kind with cartoon drawings of foxes and advice about reinforcing coups. "If it keeps up, give us a call. We can set some traps." Owen thanked him and watched him drive away, and then he walked around to the back of the property to check the mud along the tree line. The tracks stopped him cold. They were pressed deep into the soft earth where rain had fallen the night before, a line of them leading from the trees toward the chicken coop and then back again. At first glance, they looked almost like human handprints, 4 fingers and a thumb, pressed flat against the ground. But the proportions were wrong. The fingers were too long, stretched out in a way that made Owen's stomach turn. And at the end of each finger, dragging 6 inches past where the print ended, were claw marks, deep gouges in the mud, like something had raked railroad spikes through the earth. Owen crouched down and stared at the tracks for a long time, trying to make them into something he could understand. Bear, maybe. Bears sometimes left prints that looked strange, especially if they were dragging something. Or maybe a dog, a big one, walking in some unusual way. But the prints weren't bear prints. They weren't dog prints. They were hands, he couldn't deny that, looking at them. Hands that had walked across his property in the night, up to his chicken coop and back again, leaving marks that looked almost human and deeply, terribly wrong. Owen felt the morning sun on his back and the cold earth under his knees, and he thought about calling Deputy Martinez back. But what would he say? "There are handprints in my mud. Something with claws walked through my yard." He could hear how it would sound, could see the polite concern on the young deputy's face turning into something else. Worry. Pity. The look you give a man who's been alone too long and is starting to crack. He stood up and walked back to the house, and he didn't tell anyone about the tracks. That night, Owen sat in the darkness of his kitchen with the lights off, watching the tree line through the window. Ketchum lay at his feet, pressed against his legs, whining softly every few minutes. The shotgun was propped against the table within easy reach. His grandfather's 12-gauge, a weapon that had killed deer and bear, and once a man who'd broken into this very house 30 years ago. Owen waited. The silence was complete. That same suffocating absence of sound that had pressed against him for days now. No owls, no coyotes. Nothing but his own breathing and the soft whimpers of his dog. At 2:14 a.m., Ketchum stopped whining. The dog went rigid, every muscle in his body tensing at once. His eyes fixed on the window, and Owen followed his gaze to the tree line, where the darkness was thicker than it should have been. 2 points of light appeared at the edge of the woods. Owen's first thought was that they were reflections. Moonlight hitting something, a piece of metal or a shard of glass. But the moon was behind clouds and the lights weren't silver. They were amber, a warm gold color that reminded him of animal eyes caught in headlights. But they were wrong. They were too high. 8 feet off the ground, at a height where no animal's eyes had any business being. And they weren't moving the way animal eyes moved, shifting and blinking and tracking. They were fixed, steady, watching. Owen reached for the shotgun without looking away from those amber points of light. His fingers found the cold metal of the barrel, and he pulled the weapon into his lap. The lights didn't move. They didn't move. "What are you?" Owen whispered, and his voice sounded like a stranger's. The amber eyes stayed fixed on the house for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. Then, without hurry, without any apparent cause, they rose slightly higher as the creature straightened. And then they were gone, swallowed by the darkness between the trees. Owen sat in the kitchen until dawn, the shotgun across his knees, watching the tree line for any sign that the eyes would return. Ketchum had crawled under the table at some point and wouldn't come out, not even when Owen offered him food. The chickens were still huddled in their corner when Owen checked on them at first light. But now he understood why. Something was watching them. Something had been watching them for days. And whatever it wasn't a cougar, it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything that belonged in those woods or anywhere else on God's green earth. Owen Ashford had lived in the Cascade Range for 18 years, and he knew every predator that hunted these mountains. But he didn't know what had eyes that glowed amber 7 feet off the ground. He didn't know what left handprints in the mud with claws that dragged like railroad spikes. And as he stood in the gray morning light, staring at the silent tree line, he realized that he didn't want to know. But something told him he was going to find out anyway. Owen didn't go to work that day. He called in sick for the first time in 11 years, his voice thick and strange. When Hector answered the phone at the mill, the foreman didn't ask questions. Owen Ashford didn't take sick days. And if he was taking one now, there had to be a reason. Owen hung up without explaining and stood in his kitchen, watching the morning light creep across the floor, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. The amber eyes stayed with him, burned into his memory like an afterimage from staring at the sun. 7 feet off the ground, maybe more. He kept telling himself he'd been tired, that his eyes had played tricks on him in the darkness, but Ketchum's terror had been real. The dog was still under the kitchen table, and he wouldn't come out no matter what Owen tried. By 8 in the morning, Owen had convinced himself to act like a rational man. He pulled on his boots and his jacket and walked out to the tree line with the shotgun cradled in the crook of his arm. The morning was cold and clear, The kind of October day that usually made him grateful to live in this country. But today the beauty felt wrong. False. Like a mask over something rotten. The tracks were still there in the mud. Those handprints, with their impossible proportions and their dragging claw marks. Owen crouched down and studied them again, trying to see them differently in the daylight. Maybe they were bear tracks after all, distorted by the rain or his own tired eyes. Bears could stand upright. Bears left strange prints sometimes. But these weren't bear tracks. Owen knew bear tracks the way he knew his own face in the mirror, and these were something else entirely. The fingers were too long, too thin, spread at angles that no bear's paw could achieve. And the claw marks, God, the claw marks, they were like nothing he'd ever seen. Deep gouges that ran 6 inches past the end of each finger, carved into the earth with the kind of force that spoke of immense strength. Owen followed the tracks to the edge of the tree line, where they disappeared into the carpet of fallen needles beneath the cedars. He stood there for a long moment, staring into the shadows between the trees, and felt the silence pressing against him like a physical weight. No birds, no squirrels chattering in the branches, nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the distant rush of the creek. He thought about going into the woods, following the tracks to wherever they led, but his body wouldn't move. Every instinct he possessed, every survival sense honed by 52 years of living in predator country, was screaming at him to stay out of those trees, to go back to the house, to lock the door and wait. Owen Ashford wasn't a coward. He'd driven logging trucks through ice storms that would have turned other men back. He'd killed that intruder in his house 30 years ago without hesitation, putting 2 rounds of buckshot into a man who'd come through his window with a knife. But standing at the edge of those silent woods, staring into the darkness between the cedars, he felt a fear that went deeper than anything he'd experienced before, a primal terror that seemed to rise from somewhere ancient in his brain, some part of him that remembered being prey. He went back to the house and locked the door. The morning passed in a kind of daze. Owen cleaned his shotgun, a task that didn't need doing since he'd cleaned it just last week. And then he cleaned it again. He made coffee and didn't drink it. He tried to eat breakfast and found that his stomach had closed up like a fist, refusing food. At noon, he drove into Vernonia. The library was small, just a converted house on Main Street, with bookshelves crammed into every room. But it had computers with internet access. Owen had never been much for technology. His flip phone was older than some of the cashiers at the grocery store. But he knew how to use a search engine well enough. He sat down at one of the terminals and stared at the screen, trying to figure out what to type. Large predator Oregon he tried first. The results showed him mountain lions and black bears and the occasional gray wolf, animals he knew as well as his own hands. Nothing with eyes that glowed amber 7 feet off the ground. Unknown animal sighting Cascade Range. This gave him articles about Bigfoot, grainy photos of dark shapes in the woods, and testimonials from people who sounded crazy even to Owen's desperate ears. He scrolled through the results, looking for something that matched what he'd seen, but nothing fit. Bigfoot was supposed to be large and ape-like, covered in dark fur, avoiding humans. Whatever Owen had seen hadn't been avoiding him. It had been watching him, studying him maybe. Animal with glowing eyes. Cats, wolves, deer. All animals had eye shine when light hit their retinas at the right angle. But the color was wrong. Deer eyes reflected green or yellow. Cat eyes were greenish gold. Nothing he could find had eyes that glowed amber, that warm gold color that reminded him of whiskey held up to firelight. Owen sat at the computer until the librarian, a gray-haired woman named Patricia, who'd known him since he was a boy, came over to ask if he needed help finding anything. "Just doing some research," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "Trying to figure out what kind of predator's been bothering my chickens." "Oh, dear." Patricia clucked her tongue in sympathy. "We've had trouble with coyotes this year. My sister lost 3 of her cats." "Might be coyotes," Owen agreed, though he knew it wasn't. He thanked her and drove home, no closer to an answer than he'd been before. That evening he stopped at the hardware store and bought 4 more game cameras. The expensive kind with infrared sensors and motion triggers. He set them up in a perimeter around the chicken coop, spacing them 20 feet apart, angling them toward the tree line. If something came out of those woods again, he'd have proof. He'd have something he could show Deputy Martinez, something that would make people believe him. The cameras blinked their red lights in the gathering darkness, and Owen retreated to the house to wait. He sat in the kitchen with the lights off again, the shotgun across his knees, watching the tree line through the window. Ketchum had finally come out from under the table, but he stayed pressed against Owen's legs, trembling at every small sound. The old hound had never been a nervous dog, had faced down bears and coyotes without flinching. But whatever he'd sensed in those woods had broken something in him. Owen could feel the fear radiating off the animal like heat from a stove. The hours crept by. Owen's eyes burned from staring into the darkness, and his back ached from sitting rigid in the hard kitchen chair. He thought about the tracks in the mud, those stretched out handprints with their railroad spike claws. He thought about the amber eyes floating 7 feet off the ground. He thought about the silence that had swallowed the woods, that unnatural absence of sound that seemed to spread a little further each night. At 1:47 a.m., the first camera triggered. Owen saw the flash through the window, a brief pulse of infrared light at the edge of the tree line. His heart slammed against his ribs, and his hands tightened on the shotgun. Ketchum whined and pressed harder against his legs. The second camera triggered, then the third. Owen watched the sequence of lights, tracking the movement from left to right along the tree line. Something was there. Something was moving along the edge of his property, staying just inside the tree line, triggering each camera as it passed. The fourth camera triggered, and then there was nothing. Silence. Darkness. Owen waited. The minutes stretched into an hour, and then 2. Nothing else moved at the tree line. The cameras sat dark and silent, their red lights blinking steadily, recording nothing. At dawn, Owen walked out to check the memory cards. The first 3 cameras had captured the same thing. Static. Gray and white noise. Like an untuned television, exactly like the first camera he'd set up days before. But the fourth camera, the one closest to the chicken coop, the only one with a clear line of sight unobstructed by the cedar branches, had captured something different. Owen plugged the memory card into his laptop with shaking hands and opened the file. The image was dark, shot in infrared, the trees rendered in shades of gray and white. At the edge of the frame, just visible through the underbrush, were 2 points of light. Eyes. They were exactly as Owen remembered them. Amber, even in the infrared, glowing with a warm gold light that no camera should have been able to capture. They were positioned 8 feet off the ground, hanging in the darkness between the trees like stars that had fallen to earth. But there was something else in the image, something Owen hadn't seen the night before. Below the eyes, barely visible in the shadows, was the suggestion of a shape. Shoulders, broad and wrong, extending too far on either side of where a head should be. The outline of something massive, something that stood upright like a man but had proportions that belonged to no man on earth. Owen stared at the image for a long time, his coffee growing cold beside him, the shotgun forgotten on the table. He zoomed in on the eyes, trying to see more detail, but the resolution wasn't good enough. All he could see was that unnatural amber glow, that sense of intelligence and patience and hunger that seemed to radiate from the image even now in broad daylight, with miles between him and those dark woods. He thought about calling Deputy Martinez. He thought about driving the camera to the sheriff's station and showing them the image, making them understand that something was out there, something that wasn't a coyote or a bear or anything they had pamphlets for. But he could already hear what they would say. Lens flare, reflection, probably a deer standing in front of a broken tree creating an optical illusion. People saw strange things in the woods all the time. It didn't mean anything. And Owen Ashford, who'd been living alone for 7 years, who talked more to his chickens than to other humans, who'd been getting stranger and quieter ever since his wife left. Well, maybe he was just seeing things that weren't there. Owen deleted the image from his laptop and threw the memory card in the trash. Then he fished it back out, put it in an envelope, and hid the envelope in the back of his underwear drawer, just in case. The next 2 days passed in a kind of suspended animation. Owen went back to work, driving his routes through the mountains, hauling timber down roads he knew by heart. But his mind wasn't on the driving. His mind was back at the house, back at the tree line, back with those amber eyes floating in the darkness. He didn't set up the cameras again. He didn't walk the property line or look for new tracks in the mud. He told himself he was being rational, that whatever he'd seen was probably just a large animal, maybe a sick bear, maybe an elk with chronic wasting disease, and that it would move on if he left it alone. But the chickens were still huddled in their corner, facing the same direction they'd faced for over a week. The woods were still silent, and Ketchum still wouldn't go outside after dark. On the 3rd night, Owen broke. He was sitting on his porch at dusk, forcing himself to drink his 2 beers like nothing was wrong, when he saw it. The tree line was maybe 100 yards from the porch, visible as a dark mass against the fading light of the western sky. Owen had been watching it without meaning to, his eyes drawn to that edge between his cleared land and the wild woods beyond. And as the sun dropped below the horizon and the darkness gathered in the spaces between the trees, something moved. It was just a shape at first, a silhouette against the gray sky visible through a gap in the cedars. Owen might have missed it entirely if he hadn't been watching, if his eyes hadn't been tuned to that particular stretch of trees for days now. But he was watching, and he saw it. The silhouette was massive. Owen set down his beer with a hand that had started to shake. The shape at the tree line was standing upright. That was the first thing that registered, the wrongness that made his stomach drop. It was standing the way a man stands, on 2 legs, but it was too tall. Much too tall. 8 feet at least, maybe more when it stood fully upright. Owen had been a logger for 18 years, and he could judge the height of a tree from 50 yards. This thing was taller than any man had a right to be, and the proportions were wrong. The shoulders were too broad, extending on either side like the yoke of an ox. The head was shaped wrong, tapering to a point at the top, in a way that made Owen think of dogs or wolves or something in between. The arms, God, the arms, they were too long, hanging down past where the knees should be, ending in masses of shadow that might have been hands. Owen sat frozen on his porch, his beer forgotten, his breath caught in his throat. The silhouette at the tree line didn't move. It just stood there, watching him, its impossible shape outlined against the dying light. Then it took a step. The movement was wrong in a way Owen couldn't quite articulate. It covered too much ground for a single step. 30 feet, maybe more, closing half the distance between the tree line and the edge of Owen's cleared land. But the motion itself was fluid, almost graceful, like watching a dancer glide across a stage. It should have taken 3 strides to cover that distance. It had taken 2. Maybe 1. Owen grabbed his shotgun and brought it up to his shoulder, sighting along the barrel at the shape in the darkness. His hands were steady. That was the strange thing, the thing he'd think about later. His heart was hammering against his ribs and his breath was coming in shallow gasps, but his hands were steady on the gun. "Stop right there," he shouted, and his voice cracked on the last word. The silhouette stopped. It stood at the edge of the cleared land, maybe 50 yards from the porch now, a mass of darkness against darkness. Owen couldn't see details, couldn't see eyes or face or hands, just that impossible shape standing upright in the dusk, like a nightmare given form. "Whatever you are," Owen said, "this is my land. You get off my land." The silhouette didn't move, didn't respond. Then, without hurry, without any apparent cause, it turned and walked back toward the tree line. Owen watched it go, his finger on the trigger, ready to fire at the first sign of aggression. But the thing didn't look back. It just walked, that same fluid, ground-eating stride, until it reached the edge of the woods. And then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness between the trees like it had never been there at all. Owen sat on the porch until his legs stopped shaking enough to carry him inside. The beer he'd been drinking had spilled across the porch boards, and he didn't remember dropping it. The shotgun was still in his hands, his fingers cramped around the stock from gripping it too tight. Ketchum was under the kitchen table again, and Owen didn't try to coax him out. He locked the door and checked every window and pulled all the curtains closed. And then he sat in the darkest corner of the living room with the shotgun across his knees and waited for dawn. The thing he kept coming back to in those long hours before sunrise was the way it had stopped when he shouted. It had heard him. It had understood him, or at least understood enough to respond. A bear wouldn't have stopped. A cougar wouldn't have stopped. An animal would have either attacked or fled, following instinct, doing what its nature demanded. But this thing had stopped. It had considered him. It had made a choice, and then it had walked away. Owen didn't know what to do with that, didn't know how to file it in his mind, alongside everything else he knew about predators and prey, about the careful balance of violence that governed life in the mountains. This creature, whatever it was, had shown him something in that moment, shown him that it was intelligent, that it made decisions, that it had chosen to leave when it could have just as easily chosen to stay. The question was why? The next morning, Owen walked the perimeter of his property with the shotgun in his hands, looking for tracks, looking for any sign of what had stood at the edge of his cleared land the night before. He found nothing. The creature, and he was calling it that now because he had no other word for it, had left no trace, no footprints in the dew-wet grass, no broken branches at the tree line, no indication that anything had ever been there. But Owen knew what he'd seen. The silhouette was burned into his memory now, joining the amber eyes and the handprints in the mud and the silence of the woods. The creature was real. It was out there, and it was watching him. He thought about leaving, just getting in his truck and driving away, leaving the house and the land and the chickens to whatever fate awaited them. He could go to Portland, maybe, or Seattle, some city with lights and people and the comfortable noise of civilization. Some place where the woods were far away and the darkness was held at bay by street lights and the press of human bodies. But this was his home. His grandfather had built this house. His father had grown up here. Owen had buried his parents in the cemetery in Vernonia and scattered their ashes under the cedars at the back of the property, in a clearing where the sunlight filtered through the branches and the moss grew soft and green. This land was his. This land was him. He wasn't going to run. That decision made, Owen went inside and started making preparations. He reinforced the chicken coop first, adding extra boards to the frame and wrapping the whole structure in heavy-gauge wire mesh. The hens were still huddled in their corner, still facing the tree line. But they let him work around them without complaint. He wondered what they saw when they looked toward the woods, wondered if their small chicken brains could comprehend what was out there, or if they just felt the wrongness without understanding it. Next, he checked his ammunition supply. He had 3 boxes of 12-gauge shells, buckshot mostly with a few slugs mixed in, and a box of .30-06 rifle rounds for the hunting rifle he kept in the closet. He loaded both guns and positioned them around the house. The shotgun by the back door, the rifle by the front, a loaded pistol on his nightstand. If the creature came for him, he'd be ready. And he secured the house itself. He nailed boards over the basement windows and reinforced the locks on every door. He checked the flashlight batteries and set up lanterns in each room so he'd have light if the power went out. He moved his bed to the corner farthest from any window and put Ketchum's bed beside it, though the dog hadn't slept anywhere but under Owen's bed for days. By the time he finished, the sun was setting again. Owen stood on his porch and watched the darkness gather at the tree line, and he felt a strange calm settle over him. The fear was still there, would probably always be there now, a permanent resident in the back of his mind. But alongside it was something harder, something that felt almost like determination. He'd faced down dangers before, ice storms on mountain roads, a man with a knife in his living room, a marriage that had died slow and painful over the course of 20 years. He'd survived all of it. He'd survived because he didn't know how to do anything else. Whatever was out there in those woods, whatever was watching him with those amber eyes, it was going to find out that Owen Ashford wasn't easy prey. But the calm didn't last. It was sometime after 2 a.m, when the motion light triggered. Owen was in the kitchen, sitting in his chair by the window, the shotgun across his knees. He'd been drifting in and out of a half-sleep, that dangerous state where the body rests but the mind stays alert, when the sudden glare of the floodlight snapped him fully awake. The light was mounted on the back of the house, pointing toward the chicken coop. Owen had installed it 3 years ago, after a coyote had gotten into the coop and killed 4 hens before he could get there. The light was bright enough to illuminate the entire backyard, and it turned on automatically whenever something larger than a raccoon crossed its sensor. Owen was on his feet before he'd finished processing what was happening, the shotgun coming up to his shoulder as he pressed himself against the wall beside the window. He could see the coop, lit up like a stage, the wire mesh glinting in the harsh white light. He could see the tree line beyond it, the darkness of the woods pushed back by the glare of the floodlight. And he could see the creature. It was at the coop, its back to Owen, its hands, not Pa's hands, gripping the wooden frame. The motion light had caught it in the act of what? Trying to get in? Studying the structure? Owen couldn't tell, and in that moment he didn't care. The creature was massive. Standing upright, it was 8 feet tall, the same height as the eyes he'd seen in the darkness. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, stretching out on either side like the yoke of some monstrous ox. Its body was covered in fur. He could see that now in the light. Matted gray fur the color of wood ash, slicked down in places like it had been coated in something wet. But it was the head that made Owen's breath catch in his throat. The head was wrong. It tapered to a point, the skull narrowing in a way that looked almost canine, with a long snout that extended forward past where a human face would end. But the creature was standing upright on 2 legs, with its hands gripping the coop like a man might grip a fence. The proportions didn't fit. Nothing about it fit. Owen's finger found the trigger. The creature turned. The movement was slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. Its head swung around first, that long snout coming into profile, and then its body followed. Owen had a split second to register details. The ears, pointed and upright like a German shepherd's. The chest, barrel deep and covered in that same matted gray fur. The legs, which bent backward at the knee in a way that made Owen's stomach turn, before the creature's eyes found him through the window. They were amber. They glowed with that same warm gold light Owen had seen in the darkness, that awful color that reminded him of whiskey and firelight, and things that hunted in the night. But now he could see them clearly, could see the intelligence behind them, the awareness. The creature knew he was there. It was looking at him, studying him. Owen fired. The shotgun blast was deafening in the enclosed space of the kitchen, and the window exploded outward in a spray of glass. Owen racked another shell and fired again, not aiming, just shooting at that impossible shape, that nightmare that had no business existing in any world he understood. The creature staggered. Owen saw it rock backward, saw something dark spray from its shoulder where the buckshot had hit. But it didn't fall. It didn't scream. It just looked at him. Those amber eyes, still glowing, still watching, like the shotgun blast was an inconvenience rather than a threat. Then its mouth opened. The snout pulled back, exposing teeth that went too far back into the jaw, rows of them, yellow-white in the glare of the motion light, sharp as broken glass. And from somewhere deep in that impossible throat came a sound that Owen would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. It wasn't a growl, it wasn't a bark or a howl or anything an animal would make. It was almost like language. A low, rumbling vocalization that rose and fell in patterns, syllables that didn't quite resolve into words but carried meaning anyway. Owen couldn't understand it. His brain refused to process it. But some deep, ancient part of him recognized it for what it was. Communication. The creature was speaking to him. Owen reloaded with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, fingers fumbling with shells, muscle memory the only thing keeping him functional. The creature stood in his backyard, bleeding from its shoulder, its mouth still moving in those guttural, almost words. And Owen raised the shotgun and fired again. This time the creature moved. It covered the distance to the tree line in 2 strides. Impossible strides that ate 30 feet at a time. And then it was gone, vanishing into the darkness between the cedars with a crash of breaking branches. Owen heard it screaming from somewhere deep in the timber, that same not-quite language echoing through the silent woods. And he stood in his shattered kitchen with the shotgun in his hands and waited for it to come back. It didn't come back. Owen stood there until dawn, watching the tree line, waiting for those amber eyes to appear again. The motion light had turned off after 5 minutes, plunging the backyard back into darkness, and he'd turned on every light in the house to compensate. The brightness was a poor comfort, but it was all he had. When the sun finally came up, Owen walked outside on legs that felt like they were made of wood. The blood trail started at the chicken coop. Dark spots on the ground, steaming faintly in the cold morning air, leading from the coop to the tree line in a ragged path. Owen followed it with the shotgun ready, his eyes scanning the woods for any sign of movement. The blood was wrong. Too dark, almost black, with a smell like copper and rot and something else he couldn't identify. At the tree line, the trail disappeared into the shadows between the trees. Owen stood there for a long moment, staring into the woods, listening to the silence. Somewhere in those trees, the creature was bleeding, maybe dying, maybe just waiting. He thought about following the trail, thought about going in there with his shotgun and his fear and finishing what he'd started. But the woods were silent. That oppressive, pressing silence that had swallowed every sound for days now. And Owen knew with a certainty that went deeper than logic that if he walked into those trees, he wouldn't walk out again. He went back to the house and locked the door. The chickens were dead. He found them when he checked the coop an hour later, once his hands had stopped shaking enough to open the latch. All 32 of them, necks broken clean, piled in the corner where they'd been huddling for days. The creature had killed them all, silently, efficiently, without leaving a single mark on the coop itself. A message, maybe. A warning. Or just hunger, satisfied before Owen's shotgun had interrupted it. Owen buried the chickens behind the house, in the clearing where his parents' ashes lay scattered beneath the cedars. He dug 32 small graves with hands that blistered and bled, and he didn't stop until every bird was in the ground. It was pointless, he knew that. The creature could dig them up if it wanted. But Owen needed to do something, needed to feel like he had some small measure of control over a situation that had spun completely out of his understanding. When he finished, he stood among the fresh graves and looked at the tree line, and he said the only thing he could think to say, "I'm not leaving." The words fell into the silence and disappeared. But Owen would have sworn later when he was telling this story to no one, that somewhere in the depths of those dark woods, something was listening. 3 days passed without sleep. Owen sat in his truck with the engine running, the heater blowing warm air across his face, the shotgun resting across his thighs with 2 shells in the chamber, and a box of 20 more on the passenger seat. He'd pulled the truck around to face the tree line, headlights cutting through the darkness, and he watched the woods with eyes that burned from exhaustion and something deeper than exhaustion. The first night, he'd stayed inside the house, locked every door, checked every window, sat in the kitchen with his back against the wall and the shotgun pointed at the door that creature had shattered. But the walls felt too thin, the windows too fragile, and every creak of the old farmhouse sent his heart racing. By midnight, he'd retreated to the truck, where at least he could drive away if he needed to. He didn't drive away. Part of it was stubbornness. The same stubborn streak that had kept him logging these mountains for 18 years, that had kept him on this land after Sarah left, that had made him the kind of man who spoke 10 words a day because he didn't see the point in wasting breath on things that didn't matter. This was his home. His parents had raised him here. Their ashes were scattered in the clearing behind the house, mixed now with the disturbed earth of 32 chicken graves. He wasn't going to let something drive him off his own land. But part of it was something else, something he didn't want to examine too closely. The creature had stood 15 feet from him. He'd put 3 shells into its body, 2 in the chest, 1 in the shoulder, and it had staggered but hadn't fallen. It had looked at him with those amber eyes, that impossible face, and it had moved its mouth in patterns that weren't growls or snarls, but something else entirely, something that had sounded almost like words, and then it had left. Owen kept coming back to that. The thing had been hit, bleeding, probably in pain, and it had simply turned and walked away, retreated into the trees, let him live. Why? The question gnawed at him through those 3 sleepless days, keeping him alert when exhaustion should have dragged him under. He didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure he wanted one. On the second day, around noon, he drove into town. Vernonia looked the same as it always had. The mill's smokestacks rising against the gray October sky. Pickup trucks parked outside the hardware store. A handful of loggers eating lunch at the diner on the corner. Owen pulled into the gas station and filled up his tank, then went inside for coffee. The woman behind the counter, Marge, he thought her name was, though he'd never actually asked, looked at him with concern written across her weathered face. "You okay, Owen? You look like hell." "Didn't sleep well," he said, which was technically true. "There's something going around. Half the town's got that flu that's been in the news." She rang up his coffee and a handful of energy bars he grabbed from the rack by the register. "You should go home, get some rest." Owen almost laughed. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe." He sat in his truck in the gas station parking lot for an hour, drinking coffee and watching people go about their ordinary lives. A mother with 2 kids came out of the grocery store across the street, the children whining about something. The mother's face tight with the particular exhaustion of parenthood. 2 old men sat on the bench outside the barber shop, talking about something that made them both laugh. A logging truck, not one of the company rigs, probably independent, rumbled past on the main road, hauling a load of cedar that filled the air with that sweet, sharp scent. Normal. All of it so goddamn normal. Owen thought about walking into the sheriff's office. Thought about sitting down across from Deputy Martinez, who'd been so helpful with his pamphlets about livestock protection, and telling him the truth. "There's something in the woods behind my property. Something that walks on 2 legs like a man but isn't a man. Something with eyes that reflect light and a face like a wolf, and hands that can grip a wooden frame hard enough to splinter it. Something that killed all my chickens and put its fist through my kitchen door and looked at me like it was deciding whether I was worth eating. He could imagine Martinez's face. The careful, neutral expression that cops learn to wear when dealing with someone who'd clearly lost their grip on reality. The gentle questions about stress and isolation and whether Owen had anyone he could talk to. The follow-up call to mental health services. The wellness check that would come a few days later. The whispered conversations at the mill about how silent Owen had finally cracked. Owen finished his coffee and drove back to the property. The blood trail was still there when he arrived, though it had dried to a dark stain on the ground that could have been anything. He followed it again to the tree line, shotgun ready, and stood there staring into the woods for a long time. The silence pressed against his ears. No birds, no insects, no wind in the branches. Just that heavy, waiting stillness that had settled over the property, like a burial shroud. "I know you're out there," Owen said, his voice sounding strange in the quiet. "I know you can hear me." Nothing moved. Nothing answered. But Owen could feel it watching him, could feel those amber eyes somewhere in the shadows between the cedars, studying him with that cold intelligence he'd seen in the creature's face. He didn't know how he knew. Some primal instinct, maybe. Some ancient part of his brain that remembered what it was like to be prey. But he was certain of it. He was being watched. "I'm not leaving," he said again. The same words he'd spoken 3 days ago over the chicken graves. "This is my home." The silence stretched on. Owen turned and walked back to the house, feeling those unseen eyes on his back the whole way. That night, the creature came back. Owen was in the truck, fighting to stay awake, when the motion light clicked on. He jerked upright, heart hammering, shotgun coming up before his conscious mind had even registered what he was seeing. It stood at the edge of the light's reach, just barely illuminated, and this time Owen got a better look. The snout was longer than he'd realized, nearly a foot from the black nose to where the skull began to widen. The mouth was open slightly, revealing rows of teeth that went too far back into the jaw, overlapping in a way that no natural predator's teeth should overlap. Saliva, or something like saliva, dripped from the lower lip, catching the light as it fell. The fur was gray, ash gray like he'd thought before. But in the motion light's harsh glare, he could see that it wasn't uniform. Patches of darker coloring ran across the shoulders and down the chest, almost like stripes, and the texture looked wrong. Matted in some places, slick in others, as if the creature had been rolling in something wet. The blood from its wounds, maybe, or something else. But it was the hands that Owen couldn't stop staring at. They hung at the creature's sides, arms too long for its body, and they were definitely hands. Not paws, not claws, but hands with 4 fingers and a thumb, each digit tipped with a nail that curved like a hawk's talon. The nails were black and gleaming, at least 3 inches long. And as Owen watched, the creature flexed its fingers slowly, deliberately, as if making sure he could see them. Owen's chest felt tight. His breath came in short, shallow gasps that fogged the inside of the windshield. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to run, to drive, to get as far away from this thing as he could. But he couldn't move, couldn't think, could only stare at those hands, those inhuman hands, and remember the tracks he'd found in the mud, handprints with claws that dragged like railroad spikes. The creature tilted its head, studying him through the windshield with those amber eyes. Its mouth moved, forming shapes that weren't quite words but weren't quite not words either. That same almost language he'd heard before, that sound that made something in his hindbrain want to curl up and die. Then it smiled. Owen had never seen an animal smile. He'd seen dogs bare their teeth in warning, seen cougars snarl before a charge, seen countless predators display their weaponry in acts of intimidation. But this was different. This was a smile, lips pulling back, corners of the mouth turning up, an expression that conveyed amusement and hunger and something else, something that looked almost like recognition. It knew him. That was the thought that crystallized in Owen's mind, cutting through the fear like a knife. This thing knew him, had been watching him for days, maybe weeks, learning his routines and his habits and his weaknesses. The silent woods, the frightened chickens, the corrupted trail cameras. It had all been leading to this moment, this confrontation, this smile that said, "I see you and I know you and you have no idea what I am." Owen raised the shotgun with hands that shook so badly he could barely aim. The creature's smile widened, and then it was gone, melting back into the darkness beyond the motion light's reach, moving with that impossible speed that made 30 feet look like 10. Owen sat in the truck until dawn, watching the tree line, but the creature didn't return. The next morning he found the first sign that it had been inside the house. He almost missed it. He was making coffee, or trying to make coffee, his hands still trembling from the night before, when he noticed that the photo on the refrigerator had been moved. It was a picture of him and Sarah, taken on their 10th anniversary, before things had gone wrong between them. He'd kept it on the fridge for 7 years, not because he was sentimental, but because taking it down felt too much like admitting defeat. The photo had been in the upper left corner of the fridge, held in place by a magnet shaped like the state of Oregon. Now it was in the center, the magnet placed precisely above it, and when Owen looked closer, he saw that the photo itself had been turned upside down. His hands stopped shaking. Something colder than fear settled into his chest, a kind of quiet horror that went deeper than the panic of the night before. It had been in his house. While he sat in the truck, watching the tree line, the creature had circled around and come in through some other entrance, a window he'd forgotten to lock, a door that hadn't been properly secured, and it had walked through his home and touched his things. Owen searched the house room by room, shotgun ready, checking every closet and corner. He found other signs, small things, things he might have missed if he hadn't been looking. A book knocked off his nightstand, a drawer in the kitchen left slightly open, the rug in the hallway bunched up, as if something large had walked across it without caring where it stepped. And in the bathroom, written on the mirror in something that looked like mud but smelled like blood, a single word. Owen stared at the word for a long time. His reflection stared back, hollow-eyed and gaunt, a man who hadn't slept in 3 days and looked like he might never sleep again. John. What did that mean? Soon it would kill him? Soon it would leave? Soon he would understand something that his mind currently couldn't grasp? The words sat on the mirror like a promise or a threat or both, and Owen had no way of knowing which. He cleaned the mirror with bleach and hot water, scrubbing until his hands were raw. But he could still see the ghost of those letters when he closed his eyes. That afternoon he called his brother, Marcus lived in Portland, had a good job doing something with computers that Owen had never fully understood, and hadn't visited the Vernonia property in more than 5 years. They talked on the phone every few months, birthday calls mostly and the occasional holiday, but they'd never been close. Too different, their mother used to say. Owen like their father, quiet and stubborn and wedded to the land. Marcus like her, always looking toward the horizon, always wanting something more than small-town life could offer. Owen. Marcus sounded surprised, which was fair. Owen almost never called first. Is everything okay? Fine, Owen said, the word coming out automatically. Just wanted to check in. A pause. You never just check in. What's going on? Owen stood in his kitchen looking at the door the creature had shattered. He'd nailed boards across the hole, but they looked flimsy, inadequate, like something a child might build to keep out a monster. Nothing, he said. Had some trouble with predators going after the chickens. Lost the whole flock. Shit, really? What kind of predators? Don't know. Maybe a cougar. Maybe something else. Another pause. Longer this time. Owen, are you okay? You sound weird. I'm tired, haven't been sleeping well. Maybe you should come down to Portland for a few days. Get out of those woods, see some people. Diana's been asking about you. She wants to meet the mysterious brother I never talk about. Diana was Marcus's girlfriend. Owen had seen pictures but never met her. The thought of driving to Portland, sitting in Marcus's clean, modern apartment, making small talk with a woman he didn't know. It felt impossible, like something from another universe. A universe where the woods were just woods and the dark was just dark and there wasn't a creature with hands like a man's and a face like a wolf leaving messages on his bathroom mirror. Maybe, Owen said. I'll think about it. Owen, I have to go. I'll call you later. He hung up before Marcus could say anything else. The sun was setting by the time Owen finished boarding up the rest of the windows on the ground floor. It was pointless. He knew it was pointless. Knew that if the creature wanted to get in, a few boards and nails wouldn't stop it. But he needed to do something. Needed to feel like he had some small measure of control. The silence settled over the property as the light faded. That heavy pressing silence that had become the soundtrack to his life. Owen stood on the porch with his shotgun watching the tree line and tried to remember what it had been like before. Before the chickens stopped laying, before Ketchum started whining at the back door, before he'd seen those amber eyes floating 8 feet off the ground. It felt like years ago. It had been less than 2 weeks. He went back to the truck as the last light disappeared from the sky, backing it up to face the tree line like he had every night since the attack. The headlights carved tunnels of brightness through the darkness, illuminating the first row of cedars and the undergrowth beneath them. But beyond that was only black. Deep, impenetrable black that could have hidden anything. Owen sat with the shotgun across his lap and watched. Waited. The motion light clicked on at 11:47 p.m. Owen jerked awake. He'd been dozing despite himself. Exhaustion finally overwhelming his vigilance, and grabbed the shotgun before his eyes had even focused. The light illuminated the backyard in its harsh glare, casting sharp shadows across the grass and the chicken coop and the disturbed earth of the graves. The creature wasn't there. Owen scanned the yard, the tree line, the sides of the house. Nothing. The motion light stayed on for its programmed 5 minutes, then clicked off, plunging everything back into darkness except for the truck's headlights. He was about to relax, as much as he could relax, which wasn't much, when he heard it. A tap on the driver's side window. Owen turned, slowly, knowing what he would see but unable to stop himself from looking. The creature stood beside the truck, close enough to touch, its face inches from the glass. In the faint glow of the dashboard lights, Owen could see every detail: the long gray snout, the overlapping teeth, the amber eyes that reflected the dim light like mirrors. The creature's breath fogged the window, each exhale leaving a patch of condensation that faded and reformed as it breathed. It was studying him. That was the only word for it. Studying him like he was something interesting, something worth examining, a puzzle that needed to be solved, a puzzle that Owen couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His hands had turned to stone on the shotgun, fingers locked around the grip, useless. The creature raised one of those massive hands and placed it flat against the window. The glass creaked under the pressure, spiderweb cracks appearing at the edges of the creature's palm. The black nails tapped against the surface, a slow rhythm, tap, 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 like someone keeping time to music only they could hear. Then it spoke. Not words, not exactly, but sounds that formed patterns, syllables that almost made sense, a voice that was too deep and too rough but carried unmistakable meaning. Owen couldn't understand the sounds, but he understood the intent behind them. You, the creature was saying, you are mine, you have always been mine, and soon, that word again, soon, you will understand. The creature's mouth stretched into that predatory smile, and then it was gone. One moment there, the next, simply not, vanished into the darkness with that impossible speed. Owen sat in the truck until dawn, unable to move, unable to think. The creature's handprint still visible on the window glass. A perfect impression of those long fingers, those curved nails, pressed into the surface like a brand. He drove to the sheriff's office as soon as the sun came up. Deputy Martinez was at his desk, drinking coffee from a chipped mug that said, "World's okayest dad." He looked up when Owen came in, and something flickered across his face. Concern, maybe, or alarm. Owen didn't want to imagine what he looked like after 4 days without real sleep. "Mr. Ashford, what can I do for you?" Owen sat down across from the deputy's desk. His hands were shaking again, and he couldn't make them stop. "I need help." "Okay." Martinez set down his coffee, his expression carefully neutral. "What kind of help?" "There's something on my property, something killing my livestock. I've lost my entire flock. 32 chickens, all dead." "I'm sorry to hear that. Did you see what did it? Was it the same predator we talked about before?" Owen looked at the deputy, at his neat uniform, his organized desk, his wall full of commendations and certifications. Martinez was a good man, probably, a man who believed in the system, in procedure, in the rational explanations that the world usually provided. What was Owen supposed to tell him? "I don't know what it is," he said finally, "but it's not a cougar. It's not a bear. It's not anything I've ever seen before." Martinez nodded slowly. "Can you describe it?" Owen opened his mouth, and the words wouldn't come. How do you describe something that shouldn't exist? How do you explain amber eyes and a wolf's face and hands with nails like railroad spikes? How do you tell a deputy in a small-town sheriff's office that something is leaving messages on your bathroom mirror, something that speaks in a language that isn't quite language, something that pressed its hand against your truck window and told you that you belong to it? "Big," Owen said, "gray, fast, really fast." Could be a wolf, maybe? We've had some reports of wolf sightings in the area, though Fish and Wildlife says there aren't any established packs this close to town. It's not a wolf. How do you know? Because wolves don't walk on two legs. Because wolves don't have hands. Because wolves don't smile. I just know, Owen said. Martinez studied him for a long moment. Mr. Ashford, when's the last time you slept? A few days ago? A few days? The deputy's voice was gentle, careful. That's a long time to go without sleep. It can affect a person's perception. Make them see things that aren't there. Misinterpret things they do see. Owen felt a cold weight settle into his stomach. Here it was, the conversation he'd known was coming. The careful dance toward the conclusion that he'd lost his mind. I'm not imagining this. I'm not saying you are. I'm saying that when we're exhausted, our brains can play tricks on us. Add in the stress of losing your livestock, being out there alone on that property. I'm not alone. The words came out before Owen could stop them. Martinez blinked. What do you mean? Something's out there with me. Something's been watching me, and it's getting closer. The deputy was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and dialed a number Owen couldn't see. Hey, it's Martinez. Can you come down to my office? I've got someone here who needs to talk. He hung up and looked at Owen with something that might have been sympathy. I've called one of our crisis counselors. They're really good. Helped a lot of folks through tough situations. I think it might be helpful for you to talk to them. Owen stood up. His legs felt weak, unsteady, but they held him. I'm not crazy. Nobody said you were. But Mr. Ashford, Owen, something is clearly wrong. You look like you haven't slept in a week. You're talking about things watching you. You've got that shotgun in your truck that I can see through the window. I have a permit for that shotgun. I know you do. I'm not saying you don't. I'm saying that maybe right now you need some help. Not the kind of help I can give you, but help nonetheless. Owen looked at the deputy, at his concerned face, his careful posture, his hand resting casually near the radio on his belt. Not a threat, not exactly, but ready. Ready in case Owen did something that required a different kind of intervention. Thanks for your time, Owen said and walked out. He made it to his truck before his legs gave out. He sat in the driver's seat with the door open, breathing hard, his vision swimming with exhaustion and something else. Despair, maybe. The terrible knowledge that he was alone in this. That no one would believe him. That even if he found the words to describe what he'd seen, what he'd experienced, the best case scenario was that they'd think he was having a breakdown. And the worst case was that they'd lock him up somewhere for his own protection. The handprint was still on the window. Those long fingers, those curved nails, pressed into the glass like a signature. Owen stared at it for a long time. Then he started the truck and drove back to the property. There was nowhere else to go. The sun was setting by the time he arrived, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful on any other day. Owen parked in his usual spot, facing the tree line, and sat in the truck with the shotgun across his lap. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just that unnatural stillness that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. He thought about leaving, thought about throwing the truck into drive and heading south to Portland, to Marcus's clean apartment and Diana's curious questions and the blessed anonymity of the city. He could start over. Sell the property or abandon it, let the bank take it. Did it really matter? And build a new life somewhere far away from these woods and this silence and those amber eyes? But he knew it wouldn't matter. The creature had found him here. It would find him anywhere. "You are mine," it had said. Not in words, but in something deeper than words. "You have always been mine." Owen didn't know what that meant, didn't want to know, but he was starting to believe it. The motion light clicked on at 9:23 p.m. Owen raised the shotgun, sighting down the barrel at the illuminated backyard. The chicken coop stood empty and dark, its door hanging open on broken hinges. The graves of his 32 chickens were dark mounds against the lighter grass. The tree line was a wall of shadow, impenetrable, hiding whatever watched from within. The creature stepped out of the shadows. It didn't emerge gradually this time, didn't pause at the edge of the light to study him. It walked into the backyard like it owned the place. Because it did, Owen realized with a sick certainty. It had always owned this place. He was the intruder here, the trespasser, the prey animal that had wandered into a predator's territory and refused to leave. The creature stood in the center of the yard, fully visible, and Owen got his first complete look at it. It stood a full 8 feet tall on legs that bent backward at the knee like a dog's hind legs. The body was roughly humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head. But the proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long, the chest too deep. Muscle and sinew moved beneath the ash-gray fur with each breath. A display of raw physical power that made Owen's shotgun feel like a toy. The head was the worst part. It was a wolf's head, more or less. The long snout, the pointed ears, the amber eyes, but stretched and twisted and rearranged in ways that suggested intelligence, awareness, personality. The brow ridge was too prominent, the skull too large, the expression too complex. When the creature looked at Owen, he could see thought behind those eyes. Calculation, patience, and hunger. Always hunger. The creature opened its mouth and made that sound again. That not-quite language that bypassed Owen's ears and spoke directly to something deeper. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. "Come," the creature said. "Come to me. It is time." Owen's hand was on the truck door before he realized he was moving. Some part of him, some deep, primal part that predated language and logic and everything that made him human, was answering the call. The creature's voice was in his head, in his bones, pulling him toward those amber eyes like a moth toward a flame. "No." Owen gripped the shotgun with both hands, anchoring himself. The creature's call washed over him, through him, but he held on to the cold metal of the gun, to the worn leather of the seat, to the memory of his parents' ashes scattered beneath the cedars, and the 32 chickens he'd buried in the life he'd built here, brick by brick, over 40 years. "No," he said out loud. His voice cracked, dry and thin, but the word was clear. "I'm not coming to you." The creature tilted its head. Its expression shifted. Curious, maybe. Amused. It hadn't expected resistance. "Good. I don't know what you are," Owen continued, his voice growing stronger. "I don't know what you want. But I'm not yours. This land isn't yours. And I'm not going anywhere." The creature's mouth stretched into that terrible smile. It took a step toward the truck, then another, its movements slow and deliberate. Each footfall was silent despite the creature's size, its weight. Predator quiet. Hunting quiet. Owen raised the shotgun and sighted down the barrel. The creature was 30 feet away. 25. 20. "I'll shoot you again," Owen said. "I put 3 shells in you before. I can do it again." The creature stopped. Its smile widened, and then for the first time it spoke in a way that Owen could understand. The voice was wrong, too deep, too rough, as if the creature's throat wasn't designed for human speech. But the words were clear enough. 3 syllables, dragged out and distorted, but unmistakable. "Soon," the creature said. "Owen." It knew his name. Owen's finger tightened on the trigger, but the creature was already moving, turning, retreating into the shadows at the tree line, vanishing into the darkness with that impossible speed. One moment there, the next simply gone, leaving Owen alone in the harsh glare of the motion light with his shotgun pointed at nothing. His name. It knew his name. Owen sat in the truck until dawn, watching the tree line, waiting for the creature to return. It didn't. But as the sun came up and painted the sky in shades of gray and gold, Owen realized something that made his blood run cold. He couldn't leave. Not now. Maybe not ever. Because the creature wasn't hunting him, it was claiming him. And somewhere, in some deep and primal part of his mind, Owen understood that he had been chosen for something he couldn't comprehend. Something that had been waiting in these woods long before his family had built their home here. Long before the mill had carved civilization out of the wilderness. Long before humans had learned to fear the dark. He was trapped. Not by walls or chains or any physical barrier, but by something older and stronger and far more absolute. The creature had called him by name, and sooner or later, soon it had said, soon, Owen Ashford would have to answer. The morning after the creature spoke his name, Owen made a decision. He was done waiting, done hiding in his truck, watching the tree line, jumping at shadows. Whatever was happening here, whatever ancient, impossible thing had claimed this land and now seemed to be claiming him, he wasn't going to let it end on the creature's terms. If there was going to be a reckoning, Owen Ashford would choose when and how it happened. He spent the day preparing, cleaned the shotgun twice, oiled every moving part until the action was smooth as butter, loaded fresh shells, double-aught buckshot, the kind that could stop a charging bear. He dug through the garage until he found the old camping lantern his father had used, the one that ran on propane and threw light like a small sun. He tested it 3 times, made sure the fuel tank was full and the mantles were new. Then he went through the house and gathered every flashlight he could find, replacing batteries, checking bulbs, lining them up on the kitchen table like soldiers waiting for orders. Ketchum watched all of this from his corner, his old eyes tracking Owen's movements with something that might have been fear or might have been sorrow. The dog hadn't eaten in 2 days, wouldn't go near the back door, whined whenever Owen walked past. Owen knelt beside him that afternoon and ran his hands through the hound's graying fur, feeling the ribs beneath. "I know, boy," Owen said quietly. "I know you can smell it, whatever it is." He scratched behind Ketchum's ears the way the dog had always loved, and Ketchum's tail gave a single half-hearted wag. "But I can't run. This is my home, my family's home. If I leave now, I'll be running forever." Ketchum whined again, pressing his nose against Owen's palm. "When this is over," Owen promised, "we'll get you somewhere safe. Somewhere with a big yard and no trees and someone who'll take better care of you than I have lately. But I need you to stay inside tonight. Stay quiet. Can you do that for me?" The dog licked his hand once, then retreated to his corner, and curled up with his nose tucked under his paw. Owen watched him for a long moment, memorizing the shape of him, the familiar smell of old hound and cedar bedding, just in case. He ate dinner at 5 o'clock, a can of beef stew heated on the stove, eaten standing up at the counter because he couldn't make himself sit down. His hands were steady as he spooned the food into his mouth, but his mind was racing, running through scenarios, calculating distances and angles and reload times. The creature had taken 3 shells at 15 feet and kept moving. That meant he needed to be closer, needed to hit something vital. The head, maybe. Those intelligent amber eyes. Owen washed his bowl, dried it, put it away in the cabinet. He checked the shotgun one more time. He looked at the clock on the wall. 5:47. Sunset was at 6:23. Less than an hour until the darkness came, and with it, the creature. He took up his position in the chicken coop at 6 o'clock. The building was empty now, all 32 hens buried beneath the apple tree, but it still smelled like them. Feathers and dust and the dry, comfortable scent of straw. Owen sat on the overturned bucket he'd used for feeding and rested the shotgun across his knees and waited. The coop had been his great-grandfather's, built in 1912 from cedar planks and chicken wire. The wood was weathered now, gaps between the boards that let in slivers of fading light, but the structure was solid. More importantly, it had only one door and no windows. If the creature wanted him, it would have to come through that door. And Owen would be waiting. The sun went down at 6:23, right on schedule. The light bled out of the sky in layers, gold to orange to red to purple to gray to black. Owen watched through the gaps in the cedar boards as the shadows lengthened across the yard, reaching toward the coop like grasping fingers. The motion lights were off, disconnected. He didn't want their harsh glare ruining his night vision. Tonight, he would see the creature on his own terms. The silence came first. It always did. That unnatural stillness that pressed against Owen's eardrums like a physical weight. No crickets, no owls, no rustling in the underbrush. Just the heavy quiet of a world holding its breath, waiting for something ancient to walk through it. Then the smell. Copper and musk and wet fur underlaid with a sweetness that was almost like decay but not quite. The scent of something that didn't belong to the natural world. It drifted through the gaps in the coop's walls, filling Owen's nostrils, making his eyes water. He breathed through his mouth and gripped the shotgun tighter. Movement at the tree line. Owen saw it through a gap between 2 boards. A shape separating from the darkness, coming toward the yard. Coming toward him. The creature didn't hurry. It moved with that same deliberate patience it had shown from the beginning. As if it had all the time in the world. As if Owen's preparations and his shotgun and his desperate courage meant nothing at all. That was its weakness, Owen realized. The arrogance of something that had never been successfully challenged, that had spent centuries as the apex predator of these woods. It had forgotten how to be afraid. It crossed the yard in long, easy strides, its backward bending legs carrying it forward with a grace that shouldn't have been possible for something so large. Owen tracked its approach through the gaps in the wood. 50 feet. 40. 30. He could hear its breathing now, deep and slow and rhythmic. Could hear the soft thud of its footfalls on the packed earth. Could see the light from the stars reflected in its eyes. 2 points of amber glowing in the darkness. 20 feet. The creature stopped. Owen raised the shotgun, sighting down the barrel toward the door. His hands were steady, his breathing was even. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth, but his hands were steady. The creature tilted its head, that canine gesture of curiosity that looked so wrong on a body that stood like a man. It sniffed the air, once, twice, 3 times, and then it made that sound, that not quite language that bypassed Owen's ears and spoke directly to something deep and primal. "Owen," the sound said. "Owen, I have come." "I know," Owen replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been waiting for you." The creature's mouth stretched into that terrible smile, the lips pulling back over teeth that went too far into the jaw, rows of yellowed fangs catching what little light there was. It moved toward the coupe door, and Owen could see every detail now. The ash-gray fur matted with something dark and wet, the claws like railroad spikes, clicking against the ground, the muscles rippling beneath the skin with each movement. It reached for the door. Owen fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, lighting up the coupe like a camera flash. The creature staggered backward, a hole the size of a fist opening in its chest. And Owen was already racking another shell, already bringing the gun back up, already firing again. The second shot caught it in the shoulder, spinning it halfway around. The third hit its hip as it tried to retreat. The creature let out a sound that Owen felt more than heard, a roar of pain and fury that seemed to vibrate in his bones, in his teeth, in the wood of the coupe itself. But it didn't fall. It didn't die. It turned back toward him, those amber eyes blazing with fury, pure ancient fury that something so small had dared to wound it. Blood, black in the darkness, thicker than any blood Owen had ever seen, poured from the wounds in its chest and shoulder and hip, steaming in the cold night air. The creature took one step forward, then another, then another. Each step was slower than the last, but it was still moving, still coming, still alive, despite taking 3 loads of double-aught buckshot at point-blank range. Owen's hands were shaking now as he fumbled shells from his pocket, as he broke open the breech and ejected the spent casings. The creature was 10 feet away. 8. He got 1 shell seated, racked it, brought the gun up. The creature lunged. It was the first mistake the thing had made, the first time its ancient patience had given way to something more primal. It had underestimated him, had expected him to freeze the way prey always froze, had forgotten that humans were the one species on Earth that had learned to kill their predators. Owen fired as it came through the door, the blast catching it full in the face at a distance of maybe 4 feet. The creature's head snapped back, a spray of blood and bone and something else, something that sparkled in the muzzle flash like shattered glass, filling the air, the impact knocked Owen backward, sent him crashing through the back wall of the coupe in an explosion of rotted cedar and chicken wire. He hit the ground hard, the air driven from his lungs, the shotgun spinning away into the darkness. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare up at the stars wheeling overhead and wait for the creature to finish what it had started. It didn't come. Owen lay there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, gasping for breath, his ears ringing from the shotgun blasts. Then he heard it, a sound from inside the ruined coupe, a wet, gurgling sound, a sound like something dying. He rolled onto his stomach and crawled toward the wreckage, his hands finding the shotgun in the darkness, gripping it like a lifeline. The creature was lying in the doorway of the coupe, half in and half out, its massive body crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut. Owen loaded his last 2 shells and approached carefully, the gun trained on the creature's head. What was left of it? The 4th shot had done what the first 3 couldn't. The creature's skull was shattered, the amber eyes gone dark, the fanged mouth slack and still. Black blood pooled beneath the body, spreading across the packed earth of the yard in a widening stain. It was dead. Owen stood over it for a long time, his finger on the trigger, waiting for it to move. It didn't. The massive chest was still, the clawed hands limp. The intelligence that had burned behind those amber eyes was gone, extinguished, leaving nothing but a corpse. But as he stood there, Owen felt something shift inside him, a cold settling in his chest, like ice water dripping into a cavity he hadn't known existed. The creature's blood had sprayed across his face, his hands, and where it touched his skin, it burned with a cold that went deeper than temperature. He wiped at it frantically, but the sensation remained, sinking into him like ink into paper. A corpse that was already changing. As Owen watched, the creature's body began to dissolve wasn't the right word. Collapse, maybe. The flesh seemed to lose its form, the muscles and bones and organs melting together into something that looked like thick, black mud. The smell hit him first. That sweet rot smell, but stronger now, concentrated, making his eyes water and his stomach heave. Then the sound, a soft hissing like water on hot coals, as the creature's body broke apart at a molecular level. Owen backed away, his shotgun still raised, watching as the thing that had terrorized him for weeks reduced itself to nothing but a stain on the ground. Within minutes, there was nothing left. No bones, no fur, no evidence that the creature had ever existed at all. Just a patch of blackened earth that smelled like copper and decay. Owen stood in his ruined yard until the eastern sky began to lighten. He didn't move, didn't speak, barely breathed. He just stood there with his empty shotgun and stared at the place where the creature had died. When the sun came up, he went inside and sat at his kitchen table and tried to understand what had happened. The creature was dead. He had killed it. He should feel relief, triumph, something. Instead, he felt hollow, empty, like something essential had been taken from him in that final confrontation, something he would never get back. Ketchum emerged from his corner and started toward Owen, then stopped. The old hound's ears flattened, and he let out a low whine. Not the terrified whimper of the past weeks, but something different, something confused. He approached Owen slowly, sniffing the air, then pressed his body against Owen's legs, with what felt like reluctance. "It's over, boy," Owen said. "It's finally over." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. The next 3 days passed in a blur. Owen didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, despite the crushing exhaustion that dragged at his limbs like lead weights. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those amber eyes staring at him from the darkness. Every time he drifted toward unconsciousness, he heard that voice in his head, speaking his name in tones that weren't quite language. He spent the days driving. Not to anywhere in particular, just driving. Down the mountain roads he knew like the back of his hand, through the small towns that dotted the foothills, to the gas station in Vernonia for coffee he didn't really taste. He talked to the clerks and the truckers and the random strangers he encountered, not saying anything important, just talking, just reminding himself that other people existed, that the world was still there, that he hadn't died in that chicken coop and gone to some terrible, lonely hell. He ate when he remembered to, which wasn't often. He showered once, standing under water so hot it left his skin red and raw, scrubbing himself until it hurt. He checked the blackened patch of earth behind the chicken coop a dozen times, looking for any sign that the creature's body had reformed, that it had somehow survived. The stain faded a little more each day, as if the earth itself was absorbing whatever remained. On the third day, he made himself sleep. He sat in his truck with the engine running and the shotgun across his lap and closed his eyes. And when the nightmares came, and they did, they always would, he forced himself to stay under, to ride them out, to wake up on the other side still breathing. He thought about calling the sheriff's department, thought about telling Deputy Martinez everything that had happened, showing him the ruined chicken coop and the blackened earth and the trail cameras full of corrupted footage. But every time he reached for the phone, he stopped. What would he say? That he'd shot and killed a creature that shouldn't exist? A monster out of nightmare that had spoken his name and tried to claim him for something unknowable? That the body had dissolved into black mud and disappeared, leaving no evidence behind? They'd think he'd finally lost his mind. Maybe they'd be right. In the end, Owen filed a report about livestock harassment. Unknown predator, probably a bear, destroyed the chicken coop and killed all the birds. He mentioned the strange tracks, but downplayed them. Just unusual bear prints, probably a deformed paw. Deputy Martinez nodded and took notes and promised to have wildlife management look into it. He didn't ask too many questions. He didn't look too closely at Owen's hollow eyes and shaking hands. Small-town courtesy, maybe. Or maybe he just didn't want to know. Owen gave Ketchum to Marcus 2 weeks after the creature died. His brother and Diana had a house in Portland with a big backyard and a fence, and neighbors close enough to hear if anything went wrong. The dog deserved better than spending his final years with a man who couldn't stop looking over his shoulder, who jumped at every sound in the night, who had already started making plans to leave the only home he'd ever known. Ketchum seemed to understand. When Owen dropped him off, the old hound looked at him for a long moment with those wise, sad eyes, and then turned and walked into Marcus's house without looking back. It was the kindest thing Owen could do for him. It was also one of the hardest. "You sure you're okay?" Diana asked, standing on the front porch with her arms crossed while Marcus loaded the dog's bed into the garage. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks." "I'm fine," Owen said. "Just time for a change. The place is too quiet since the chickens died." She didn't believe him. He could see it in her eyes, and he knew Marcus had told her everything. The strange phone call, the weeks of silence, the way Owen had sounded when he finally called back. But she didn't push. She barely knew him, and that made it easier somehow. "Call me if you need anything," she said. "I mean it, Owen, anything." "I will." He didn't. Owen put the property up for sale in November, 2 months after the creature died. The realtor was a young woman named Jennifer, who drove up from McMinnville in a white SUV and walked around the land with her phone out, taking pictures and making notes. She loved the location, she said. Loved the trees, the privacy, the mountain views. With some work on the buildings and some cleanup, she could have it sold in 6 months, maybe less. "What happened to the chicken coop?" she asked, gesturing toward the collapsed structure. "Bear got into it," Owen said, "and he tore the whole thing apart." "Oh, that's terrible. Were you hurt?" "No, just scared them off with some noise. They don't usually come this close to houses. Jennifer nodded, making a note. We'll have to disclose that to buyers. Some people are nervous about wildlife. Owen almost laughed at that. Almost told her that bears were the least of anyone's worries in these woods. That there were things out there that made bears look like house cats, that made cougars look like kittens. But he kept his mouth shut and nodded and signed the papers she put in front of him. The property sold in 3 months to a young couple from Seattle who wanted to get away from the city and raise goats. Owen tried to warn them, in his own way, mentioned the quiet woods, the strange animal behavior, the importance of keeping lights on at night. They smiled and nodded and probably thought he was just a paranoid old man. Maybe they'd be fine. Maybe whatever had lived in those woods had died with the creature Owen killed. Or maybe something else would come, something older and worse, and the young couple would learn the same lessons Owen had learned. He couldn't save everyone. He could barely save himself. Owen moved to Salem in February. The apartment was small and beige and utterly unremarkable. A 1-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building that looked like every other building on the block. The elevator was slow. The walls were thin, and the only view was of another apartment building across the street. Owen loved it. He loved the traffic noise that never stopped, the sirens that wailed at all hours, the neighbors who played music too loud and argued too late. He loved that when he looked out his window at night, he saw streetlights and neon signs and the glow of 1,000 other windows. No trees, no darkness, no silence pressing against his eardrums like a physical weight. He got a job driving delivery trucks for a restaurant supply company. The routes were all urban, all well lit, all traveled by dozens of other drivers throughout the day. His co-workers were young and loud and thought Owen was a bit odd. The quiet old guy who never joined them for drinks, who always left right at 5, who flinched sometimes at sounds no one else seemed to hear. But they were friendly enough and the work was steady, and Owen didn't have to think too hard while he was driving. His brother called every Sunday, right at 2 o'clock, with the same careful questions asked in the same careful tone. How was the new apartment? Was he eating okay? Had he thought about talking to someone, a therapist maybe, or a counselor? Owen answered in monosyllables, deflected the probing, and let the conversations drift into silence. After a few months, his brother's calls became less frequent. Every other Sunday, then once a month, then just holidays. Owen told himself he was grateful for the space. Mostly he was. The friends from the mill stopped reaching out after Owen refused 3 invitations to drive up for beers and a poker game. He made excuses at first. Busy with work, busy with unpacking, just not feeling up to it. But eventually he just stopped answering the phone. It was easier that way. Easier than trying to sit in a bar with men he'd known for 2 decades and pretend everything was normal, pretend he hadn't seen something that shattered his understanding of the world, pretend he wasn't always listening for that terrible voice in the back of his mind. He made a kind of peace with being alone. He'd never been much for company anyway, even before. The difference now was that the solitude felt necessary, protective, like a wall he'd built between himself and everything that could hurt him. As long as he stayed in the light, stayed in the noise, stayed surrounded by the comfortable chaos of civilization, he was safe. Or at least he could pretend to be. Owen is 54 now. He's lived in the same Salem apartment for 3 years, worked the same delivery job, kept the same careful routines. He wakes at 4 a.m. out of habit, even though he doesn't have to. He drinks his coffee black, standing at the window watching the city come to life below him. He goes to work, drives his routes, comes home. He eats dinner in front of the television, whatever's on, just for the noise. He goes to bed with all the lights on and the TV playing quietly in the other room, because complete darkness still makes his chest tight and his palms sweat. The shotgun is in his closet, loaded, cleaned, ready. He knows it's probably unnecessary here, 4 floors up, miles from the nearest patch of real wilderness. But he can't make himself get rid of it. Can't make himself sleep without knowing it's there. Some nights he wakes to phantom sounds, scratching at the window, breathing in the hallway. A voice, just at the edge of hearing, speaking his name. He tells himself it's nothing. Echoes from the neighboring apartments, traffic noise distorted by distance, his own damaged mind playing tricks on itself. Sometimes he believes it. Other nights he lies awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, remembering. He remembers the creature's eyes, amber and intelligent and hungry. He remembers the feeling of its voice in his head, bypassing his ears, speaking directly to something primal and terrified. He remembers the way it had said his name. Owen. Owen, I have come. As if it had known him. As if their meeting had been inevitable. As if everything in Owen's life had been leading to that moment in the ruins of his chicken coop. And he remembers, too, what it had said before that final confrontation, that it was claiming him, that it had chosen him for something, that sooner or later he would have to answer. Sometimes Owen catches his reflection at odd angles in darkened windows in the chrome of his delivery truck, and something about his eyes looks wrong. A flash of amber that vanishes when he looks directly. A depth that wasn't there before. He tells himself it's the lighting, the lack of sleep, the slow unraveling of a mind that was never quite right after what he witnessed. But dogs shy away from him now. Cats flee when he enters a room. The pigeons on his windowsill scattered one morning and never came back. And sometimes in the deepest part of the night, Owen feels something stir in that cold place in his chest, something that was placed there when the creature's blood touched his skin, something that listens when the darkness whispers. Owen killed the creature. He's certain of that. He saw the body dissolve, watched the blackened earth absorb what remained. Nothing that destroyed could still be alive. Nothing that utterly erased could ever return. But sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, when the TV's drone seems very far away and the city's noise fades to nothing, Owen wonders if killing the creature was really the end. Wonders if the thing that stalked his family's land was unique, singular, alone in the world, or if it was just one of many. Wonders if its death somehow marked him, tagged him, made him known to others of its kind. He wonders why it let him live as long as it did, why it played with him, terrorized him, called his name in the darkness instead of simply killing him the way it killed his chickens. He wonders what it wanted, what it really wanted, and whether he escaped something unimaginable or merely postponed it. The creature is dead. Owen survived. But survival, he's learned, is not the same as victory. Survival is learning to live with what you've seen, what you've done, what you can never forget. Survival is waking up every morning and choosing to keep going, even when a part of you wonders if it would be easier to stop. Owen Ashford survived his encounter in the woods. He killed the thing that hunted him, lost everything he'd built, and started over in a city where the lights never fully go out. He is alive, and he is as safe as anyone can be in a world where creatures like that exist. But he will never go into the woods again. Not for hunting, not for camping, not even to drive through on his way somewhere else. He knows what lives in the darkness between the trees. He knows that the boundary between the human world and something older, something hungrier, is thinner than anyone wants to believe. And some nights, when the memories crowd too close and the phantom sounds seem too real, Owen sits by his window and watches the city lights and thinks about the creature's voice in his head, speaking his name. He thinks about the way it had smiled at him, those rows of teeth gleaming in the darkness. He thinks about what it might have meant when it said it was claiming him. He killed it. He's sure of that. Almost sure, but in the deepest, most honest part of himself, the part that still remembers how it felt to be prey, to be small, to be nothing but meat in the jaws of something that existed before humans learned to fear the dark. Owen Ashford knows that he got lucky. He survived not because he was strong or smart or brave, but because some combination of desperation and chance allowed him to put a shotgun blast through the creature's skull at point-blank range. If it had been faster or smarter, or if Owen's hands had shaken just a little more, but it doesn't matter now. It's over. Owen survived. That has to be enough. He sits by the window watching the lights, listening to the distant drone of traffic. The shotgun is in the closet. The TV is playing in the other room. And somewhere, in the dark spaces between the streetlights, the city holds its breath and waits. Owen Ashford doesn't go into the woods anymore. He doesn't have to. The woods, he's learned, are everywhere. In the shadows, behind buildings, in the silence between sounds, in the part of the night that even city lights can't quite reach. He survived. That's his story. That's all he knows for certain. And if sometimes late at night he hears something that sounds almost like a voice whispering his name, well, some questions are better left unanswered.